Well, folks, with last week's Gamescon event and the midnight info dumps, retail has kind of fallen a bit off the radar for content creation, including, of course, the ongoing test for Legion Remix over on the 11.25 PTR. With the success of the Mists of Pandaria event, a repeat using one of the most beloved World of Warcraft expansions ever, Legion seems, at least in the surface, to be a bit of a slam dunk success, which means that the level of criticism that has been emerging from the Remix PTR test has been rather surprising. So much so that it was almost starting to feel like the development team was on the verge of snatching defeat from the jaws of victory. Almost, that is. As it turns out, that criticism has reached Blizzard, who this week issued an initial response, just as their planned test came to an end. Their update did not provide any concrete details, but it does promise that they are going, to use their words, be launching some major improvements, focusing on adding speed, power and fun to the mode. Obviously, it is for us, the player base, to be the judge of how much fun Blizzard's changes will turn out to be. But the wording in the announcement does, at least to me, suggest that they do have a bit of a handle on what the issues that the player base have been experiencing actually are. With the launch of Remix likely just over 5 to 6 weeks away, the team will be very limited in what they can deliver change-wise in that time, but there are for sure still some levers that they can pull. The most prominent criticism has been that it has been too slow, and I think that that itself was driven by two main factors, one of which is a bit of an old chestnut: time gating. Unlike Mop Remix, where all of the content, including all of the raids, was there to be played on day one, for Legion Remix, the team had announced a plan to release the content in fortnightly phases, which for the most part aligned with the original Legion major patches. As someone who started playing World of Warcraft right at the end of Legion, and who at the time regretted having not been there as the content was released, this idea did hold some appeal to me. But for most players who were there, this, I don't think, really felt like it added much to their experience. Especially when the Remix format is one whose defining feature has been go fast. And this proposal of time gating, of course, arrived on top of a player base who is still feeling the residual frustrations of the excessive multi-layered time gating of patch 11.15 and the less severe, but still not particularly great feeling, time gating of the open world content in Koresh. So really, the only surprise here is that the World of Warcraft dev team was seemingly expecting that this would have somehow landed well. The other main criticism has come from the leveling experience, which takes on average 7 hours to complete. Now honestly, given the scale of Legion's content, I personally don't feel that 7 hours is all that excessive, but I do get that the people who enjoyed the Remix raiding scene will want to be able to get into it faster. But at the same time, I do think it is worth acknowledging that the open world of Legion was a major part of that expansion. That said, I do feel that the Remix intro quests, which similar to the Mop Remix ones, act like a mini tutorial to introduce us to the vendors and Remix power systems, was, unlike Mop's equivalent, overly long. I spent at least half of that initial experience wondering when I was going to get to visit my order hall for the first time, especially after it made me get my first artifact weapon, only to then send me to do the original artifact questline in order to get a copy of it to destroy. Now, if it sounds like I just made a bit of a bad joke, I have some bad news for you. I didn't. That really happened for my paladin, and with a setup like that, I can totally get why quite a few people have ended up feeling a bit impatient with the whole process. There was also one other glaring issue in the testing, and that is that other old chestnut with these type of events: reward pacing. One of the original criticisms of Mop Remix was that the bronze currency was used both for the extensive cosmetic rewards and also for upgrading gear. For some players, this did create an interesting tension, where they had to choose whether to prioritise cosmetics first or focus on power acquisition with the goal of speeding up that cosmetic acquisition later on. And it did also mean that different playstyles were well catered for. For example, I personally got all of the mounts and a bunch of toys and transmogs just by running 2 characters through the campaign and ignoring all of that power upgrade and raiding stuff. But there is no doubt that a sizable segment of the player base did find that tension a bit frustrating, and that was especially the case for completionists. This time around, the team decided to split things up, with bronze being limited to a cosmetic only currency and power acquisition purely via gearing and artifact weapons progression. Unfortunately, the knowledge that we players would not be spending bronze on power upgrades seems to have also prompted the dev team to make cosmetic acquisition substantially more grindy, with massive cost inflation. In Legion Remix, it takes 4.6 million bronze to get all of the cosmetics, compared to just 800,000 in MOP Remix. With multiple mounts costing as much as 100,000 bronze, it was starting to look like it could be a bit of a painful experience for more casual completists. Now, of course, this isn't our first rodeo, and that would almost certainly have been buffed post-launch in a repeat of what we saw with multiple events in the last couple of years. But as always, this kind of thing does leave a bit of a bad first impression. And all of these issues were very likely going to be exacerbated by Legion Remix launching relatively earlier in the season, meaning that we'd all have been juggling Remix with Season 3 and eventually with 11.27's content, which includes a promised new game mode event and player housing, not to mention, of course, the midnight beta cycle. The big question now is, will Blizzard's planned changes be enough to address these reported issues and pivot Remix back to the feel that was so beloved in the MOP Remix version? Well, we will get an answer to this next week, as Blizzard also, in their announcement, told us that there will be a fresh round of testing for MOP Remix starting early next week, which will contain at least some of the planned improvements, along with, I suspect, a more concrete announcement of how they're going to change Legion Remix for the better. Given that the announcement of midnight at BlizzCon was, at least for those of us who did not attend the event in person, marred by some pretty major organisational issues, so severe in fact that many players have described it as the worst expansion announcement ever, the game, in my opinion, is very much in need of plenty of positive press in the coming months. And so I do hope that the WoW team are able to get Remix back on track, especially in player perceptions, as a positive vibe around the live game as we roll into the midnight testing phase is, at least for existing and potentially returning players, the most effective way for both the game and the dev team to recover. Now, moving over to the live game, and the new season is well underway, with the race to World First having been won by Liquid, with Echo and Method taking up the second and third place slot. The conclusion of the race is invariably very quickly followed by some major nerfs to at least the mythic raid bosses, as the dev team seek to bring the raid within reach of the remainder of the Hall of Fame guilds. At the time of uploading this video, these changes haven't yet been announced, but with the final boss having been widely reported by the big 3 guilds as being one of the hardest encounters to date, I'd be very surprised if we don't see some announcements in time for this week's coming reset. There is, though, at least one other update that is in the pipeline, which is to the new spell density option, which should act like a kind of smart filter to reduce unnecessary visual clutter from our fellow players' spells and hopefully also improve FPS in Raid. If you have given this setting a try out already, you may well be wondering what the point of it is, as it doesn't really appear to do very much currently. Well, as it turns out, the reason for that is that it's completely bugged, and Blizzard have confirmed that a fix for it is in the pipeline, albeit there is currently no firm timescale in when that will go live. This does have the potential to be a pretty major quality of life improvement for raiders, so I do hope that they get it up and running soon. In the meantime though, this Monday sees the start of September, and that means a brand new trading post, which this month is taking on a distinctly dwarven theme. And if you're a mount collector who has some spare tender to burn, this could well be a month for you, with 3 mounts. 2 of these mounts are brand new to the post, and are the Cinder Plumed Highland Griffin for 600 tender, and the Ornery Breeze Strider for 325. And along with that, we're getting a returning mount, Keglegs Radiant Crocolisk. If you're currently up to date with Trading Post mounts, then the 2 new mounts add up to only 975 tender, and so will be obtainable, albeit you're not going to have very much left to spend on the other stuff, such as these rather nice looking transmog sets, or for adventurers in more hostile climates, a quirky rainwear set. And staying with the theme of this being a trading post for mount collectors, the monthly reward for completing the trader's journey takes us back to more Griffin mounts with a high Shaman's Airy Griffin. Now, while Griffins tend to be the aerial equivalent of horses for Alliance players, these new models are very high resolution, and at least for me are probably the most attractive and interesting Griffin mounts we've ever seen, so I'll for sure be snapping these all up. Other than mounts, I very rarely spend tender, and I've thankfully built up quite a bit of a stockpile, and I have to say these transmog and weapon sets are pretty enticing as well. Now, while Gamescon is all over and done with, in keeping with its overall theme of drip feeding information to us players, we did this week get a couple more interviews. In an interview with Italian content creator Pew Pew Mika, we got a few more tantalising details about the new player experience. Currently, one of the biggest pain points for new players is not Exile's Reach itself. It's the way that when they leave, they are dropped into Stormwind or Orgrimmar to what I personally describe as being quest soup. While it's true that when the new players arrive in Stormwind or Orgrimmar, the next quest giver is right in front of them, for even remotely observant players, they will also encounter a dazzling array of other, but of course completely irrelevant quests, along with, sadly, multiple, sometimes game-breaking phasing bugs. A fairly regular question, for example, in newcomer chat, is players trying to figure out how to obtain a standard scope, an engineering item that is part of the selfie cam quest. In Midnight, the updated Exile's Reach storyline will be designed to be much more of an introduction to Dragonflight, and players will now, instead of being sent to Stormwind, will be flown by the dragons straight to the Waking Shore, hopefully giving them a much more coherent experience. Now, if you've been wondering how these changes to the new player experience will impact Chromie time, the good news for old hands is that it won't. While new and returning players will be much more emphatically pushed into the intended experience, we will still have access to Chromie for the alts, even if we just want to do it for Lore Master. The team was asked about the potential to make Chromie time available at higher levels for people who do want to complete an entire expansion story. But unfortunately, while the developers did acknowledge that this was a good idea, they have no current plans to change Chromie at all for now. Mika also asked the developers about the team's ultimate plans to potentially completely replace some of our favourite add-ons. The developers asked did not provide any concrete information about potential upcoming restrictions to add-ons, but the wording of the response was very interesting to me, as they focus far more on the desire to build out new functionality in the base user interface and to provide us the information we need to render many of those add-ons unnecessary, along with a desire to change the design of encounters, something that they hinted we will start to see in earnest in Midnight. While some of the recent communications from the WoW team has been hinting that add-on restrictions could be coming early in Midnight, the phrasing in this interview does make me wonder if they have decided to push that a little further down the line, in favour of focusing a lot more on upfront delivery of the intended changes, a strategy that I do hope will turn out to be the case. Now, in some of the other Gamescom interviews, we did have a little bit of a teaser about the potential return of Sylvanas. The big question, of course, was what that will look like, i.e. would she be returning as a prominent character or maybe just in a cameo style appearance? Well, in the Mika interview, the team shared that Windrunner Spire will see us learning more about Sylvanas along with Verisa, Illyria and even the brother Lyris. this does make me feel pretty strongly that Sylvanas' appearance will likely be relatively fleeting, and so if you are a Sylvanas fan, I do strongly recommend that you do not set yourself up for future disappointment. Now, one of the other main focuses of some of these post-event interview releases has been player housing, something that was surprisingly quiet in terms of new information at Gamescom proper. We did already find out that as well as human and orc themed buildings, we would be getting night elf and blood elf variants as well. But in an interview with Taliesin and Evitel, there was one big surprise. It turns out there's going to be no faction restrictions on those choices, which means that if you would like to have an orc roundhouse in the Alliance housing zone, that will be perfectly possible, which, given the WoW team's historical desire to remain true to the game's lore, is a very interesting choice for them to have made. I do find myself wondering what people in Alliance neighbourhoods are going to make of that, not to mention the Horde neighbourhoods, where I bet we may end up seeing rather a lot of human-themed houses. The last of the post-event interviews was a written one from Destructoid, and in that interview it appears that at least one of the main story threads of the War Within is going to be put to one side for quite a bit. When asked about the Black Blood, a feature of both the initial Azkahet leveling campaign along with the Undermine Zone storyline, the developers reported that we are not likely to see it again in Midnight, explaining that Black Blood is Old God related. But they did go on to say that it would probably come up sometime in the future, which I would bet will be in the Last Titan. We also got a very short description of what Midnight's themes would look like, which is to be focusing a lot more on the cosmic side of the void, which is going to have, it was said, a more airy theme with more light and crystals. Now, I'm hazarding a guess that that latter comment could be a bit of a slip or just misreporting, as light and airy really doesn't fit the void. But it would, of course, fit with the Void's most determined opponents, the Light, and crystals do make me wonder how long it's going to be before we see the Naru putting in an appearance. And finally, I have two little interesting bits of information, both of which came from the fireside chats at Gamescom, which very sadly have not been made public as VODs, even though the presenters, Mr. GM and Taliesin and Evitel, have both been asking Blizzard for updates on what's happening to them. The first of these from Taliesin concerns professions, where it turns out that the lowest tiers of profession quality are going to be retired, with only the top two tiers remaining, largely because most players have very little interest in the lower tiers. Now, it wasn't clear to me if this is just for gear, which has 5 tiers, or if it will also affect crafting materials and consumables, which only have 3. If it was to affect the latter, I personally guess that these will be going down to only 1 tier. Either way, no matter what Blizzard's plans actually are, I do think that this will very likely simplify crafting quite a bit. And the other little tidbit came from Mr. GM, who revealed on one of his live streams that his understanding is that Valorstones may be going away with the next expansion, which of course does raise some questions about what the upgrade system will look like in the future. For example, is this also going to change how crests are acquired and work? Unfortunately, the lack of widespread access to the VODs for these fireside chats mean that both of these snippets, while super interesting, do come without much context and end up raising many more questions than they answer. And that's it for this week's update. I'd be super interested to hear what you are hoping for from Legion Remix. Just how fast do you want it to be? Comment down below. If you found this update helpful, entertaining, and even just plain annoying, then do let me know by hitting that like icon. And if you want to support my channel to grow and to help me make more of these videos along with my other content, then do hit that subscribe button right now before you forget. And if you don't want to miss out whenever I release a new video, then as well as subscribing, you can follow me on social media for notifications. My link's in the description below as well. That's all for now. Thanks for watching.